A courtroom, meant for justice, became the site of a public execution of dignity. The words of Judge Raymond Sterling, heavy with decades of unchallenged prejudice, hung in the sterile air, poisoning the silence. 12-year-old Amara Johnson, her skin the color of strong coffee, stood like a statue, clutching a small, worn charm. The judge had just delivered his verdict, not on the case, but on her worth. "This court has no time for such theatrics," he sneered, his gaze sweeping over her with calculated contempt. What he didn't know was that the small, silent girl he had just dismissed was the central witness in a far greater trial, one that would begin precisely 5 minutes from now, when the heavy oak doors would be broken by the sound of military boots. The courtroom's polished marble floor reflected the harsh midday sun, making the mahogany benches gleam. Judge Raymond Sterling, a man whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of weary superiority, leaned over the bench. "Young woman, this is a court of law, not a Saturday morning sermon on social equity," he declared, his voice cutting through the tense silence. 12-year-old Amara Johnson, neat in a crisp white shirt and a dark skirt, did not flinch, but her hands, resting on the witness stand, pressed tightly against the cool wood. She had come to testify about a routine property dispute, but the judge had quickly derailed the proceedings, focusing instead on her presence. "Frankly, your testimony is irrelevant noise. You don't belong here, not on a day this important." The air grew thick, pressing in on Amara's chest, a suffocating silence where the law was meant to speak. She stood firm, her deep brown eyes. Amara opened her mouth to speak, but the judge silenced her with a sharp rap of his gavel. "Enough. I will not have my court turned into a distraction by peripheral witnesses," he stressed the word, his tone a polished, systemic exclusion. A wave of isolation washed over her, every lawyer and clerk seemed to fade into the courtroom's heavy shadows, leaving her alone in the spotlight of injustice. She didn't look down, but her right hand instinctively went to the small, worn silver whistle hanging from her neck, a gift from her father that he had carried on 3 deployments. Judge Sterling pointed a thick finger towards the double doors. "Security, escort this child out. Now. Before I hold someone in contempt." The security guard hesitated, looking from the small girl to the commanding judge, but then started to move forward. Amara kept her gaze locked on the judge. She took a breath, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the hushed room. "May I make one call, Your Honor?" A courtesy call. The request was so formal, so unexpected, that it created a slight pause. Sterling laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Who are you calling, little girl? Your mother to tell her you're late for recess?" "No, Your Honor," Amara said, her voice now steady. "My father. He expects an update." Sterling's smile vanished. He saw the small, plain silver whistle in her hand, a detail he missed before. "You have 60 seconds. She quickly dialed a number on the court-provided phone, her back now to the judge. She did not speak. She only listened, then delivered 2 short words into the receiver. "Dad. Code Alpha." Then, she hung up and placed the phone back on its cradle. The silence that followed was agonizing. Sterling leaned in, his face tight with fury at her defiance. "Code Alpha? What is this nonsense? I gave you a chance to leave quietly. You wasted it. Now you face the consequences." He raised the gavel high. Amara looked straight into his eyes, her posture absolutely firm, unmoving. The judge was about to bring the gavel down when the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom burst open. It wasn't the sound of the public gallery, but the rhythmic thud of combat boots on marble. Every head snapped toward the entrance. In walked a man in a pristine army uniform, Colonel Marcus Johnson, Amara's father, flanked by 2 armed military police officers and a man carrying a briefcase labeled JAG Corps. The judge, his face slack with shock, stammered, "Colonel. I don't understand. This is a closed session." Colonel Johnson ignored him, his eyes still on his daughter. Amara gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. The colonel finally turned to the bench, his voice resonating with an authority that dwarfed Sterling's. He didn't use an adjective to describe the judge's actions. He simply stated a fact, a powerful reversal of Amara's dismissal. Judge Sterling, your actions today have constituted a clear abuse of power and obstruction of a federal witness. The man from the JAG Corps stepped forward, placing a thick sheaf of papers on Sterling's bench. You are hereby served with a warrant for immediate removal from the bench pending investigation. The witness, Amara Johnson, is now in federal protective custody. Sterling gasped, collapsing back into his chair. It wasn't a fight. It was a surgical operation of justice. The MP officers moved to escort the now disgraced judge out. As he was led past the witness stand, Sterling whispered a final, venomous word at Amara. She met his gaze with the unwavering focus of a veteran. Her father knelt beside her, checking the tiny silver whistle she still held. You called the code, Amara. You stood your ground. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew the cost. He gently put his hand on her shoulder and they walked out, passing the stunned courtroom. The courtroom was left silent, empty of the judge's oppressive presence. As they reached the doors, Amara looked back, a faint, determined smile on her face. For the first time that day, the scales of justice felt truly balanced. The case was closed, but the conversation had just begun.